In these next two lessons, we're going to finish up our chapter on fractions and decimals, and then this is actually the last chapter that we're going to be doing on fractions and decimals before we move into geometry. Let's take a look at adding fractions. So we know that when we add fractions, the denominators have to be the same before we add them. Unfortunately, with the fractions that we're going to be dealing with, the denominators are not always going to be the same. So we have to make sure that the denominators are the same before we add our fractions. Now, fortunately, we're going to be adding tenths and hundredths. So we know how to change a tenth to a hundredth or a hundredth to a tenth. So that's all we're going to have to do. We're going to have to do a simple change, and then we can go ahead and add. So let's take a look at the first problem. We have 3 tenths plus 21 hundredths. Now we notice that tenths and hundredths are not the same. We look at 21 hundredths and we can't go ahead and turn that into tenths because there's a 1 in the hundredths place and we can't just disappear that 1. So we're going to need to do something to our tenths. So we're going to look at 3 tenths and we need to turn 3 tenths into hundredths. So how do we take 3 tenths and turn it into hundredths is our question. So 3 tenths equals something over 100. What are we going to do? Well, when we turn tenths into hundredths, we need to multiply our denominator times 10, which means we multiply our numerator times 10, and we get 30 hundredths. Notice all we're really doing is adding a 0 to the numerator and to the denominator to turn 3 tenths into 30 hundredths. So that's all we're really going to do. We're going to go ahead and we're going to take our fraction 3 tenths and we're going to add a 0 to the numerator and to the denominator, and now we have 30 hundredths. Now we see that our denominators are the same. So once our denominators are the same, we can add our fractions. So we're going to go ahead and add. We know when we add fractions that our denominator stays the same, so our denominator is going to remain 100, and then all we're doing is adding 30 plus 21, and we get 51. So our answer is 51 hundredths. And we did that by making sure that our denominators were the same before we added our fractions. Let's take a look at the next one. We have 41 hundredths, and then we have 2 tenths. Now we notice that 2 tenths and hundredths are not the same, so we're going to need to change our tenths into hundredths. All we need to do in order to change our tenths into hundredths is add a 0 to my numerator and my denominator. Now I've changed 2 tenths to 20 hundredths, and I can add. So 41 plus 20 gives me 61, and my denominator of 100 remains the same. And that's adding fractions. So go ahead and give these next few a try. 37 hundredths plus 1 tenth. Again, the denominators are not the same, so denominators have to be the same before you can add. For this problem, we're going to change 1 tenth to 10 hundredths, and then we're going to add, so we're left with 47 hundredths. Next one is 4 tenths plus 27 hundredths. 4 tenths and 27 hundredths don't have the same denominator, so we're going to change them to hundredths, so now they both have hundredths, and when we add them, we get 67 hundredths. When we look at 46 hundredths and 5 tenths, go ahead and add those. Again, they don't have the same denominator, so we need to change 5 tenths to 50 hundredths, and then we add, and we get 96 hundredths. And then the last one, 7 tenths plus 13 hundredths. Again, 7 tenths does not have hundredths in the denominator, so we're going to add those zeros, and now they're both hundredths, and then we can add them together, and this gives us 83 hundredths. All right, that's adding fractions. Again, make sure your denominators are the same before you add. Let's take a look at adding money. When we're adding money, we need to make sure we line up our decimal before adding. So with fractions, we needed to make sure that our denominators were the same. With our decimals, we need to make sure that our decimals are lined up. Now, what does that mean? Well, if we're going to write these vertically, we're going to have our 27 cents, and notice where our decimal is, and that needs to be lined up with our decimal of 18 cents. And then when we add, we make sure that we add normally, and we bring down the decimal right where it is. That decimal is not going to change spots. And so I'm going to add, and I'm going to get 45 cents as my final sum. Again, when I do the next one, I want to make sure that I line up those decimals. So I have 39 cents, and then I have 68 cents, And when I'm adding, I'm going to bring that decimal all the way down. So this decimal is going to come down to here. And then I'm going to add normally. So 9 plus 8 gives me 17. I carry. 1 plus 3 is 4 plus 6 is 10. I carry, and I have 1. It's really important that I bring down that decimal so that I can get $1.07. This way my decimal is already in the correct location and all my place values are lined up. Go ahead and give these next few a try. The first one is 27 cents plus 33 cents. This one might be something that you can do in your head if you're adding 27 plus 33. This is going to give us 60 cents. Then we're going to go to 51 cents plus 43 cents. Again, this might be something that you do in your head, but if you do write it down and you line up your decimals, remember to bring that decimal down. So then when we add, we end up with 97 cents. Next one is 53 cents plus 21 cents. Go ahead and add. And when we add these, we get 74 cents. And then the last one is 63 cents plus 15 cents. Go ahead and add this one. And again, make sure that decimal comes down in the right place, and then we have 78 cents for this answer. Okay, that's adding money. Make sure our decimals are lined up. We add straight down, put your money sign, you're good to go. What is the sum of 23 hundredths and 5 tenths? Go ahead and find the sum. Well, what does sum mean? The sum is the answer to an addition problem, so this is going to be an addition problem. We have 23 hundredths plus 5 tenths. Notice that the denominators are not the same. We can't add until those denominators are the same, so make sure your denominators are the same before you add. When we add, we're going to have to turn this to 50 hundredths, and then we go ahead and we add, and we get 73 hundredths as our sum, or the answer to the addition problem. All right, now the last thing we're going to take a look at is comparing decimals. Now, just like with fractions that we can't add them if the denominators aren't the same, we need to make sure with our decimals that we're dealing with the same place values. It's really confusing sometimes when we're dealing with tenths and hundredths if the place values aren't the same. So for example, we have 23 hundredths and then 4 tenths. By first glance, it could look like 23 hundredths is the larger decimal just because we see a 23 and we see a 4. But don't make that mistake. If one of the decimals is in hundredths, be sure to make them both in hundredths. Add that 0 to the tenth and turn it into hundredths so that we're not confused. For example, we have 23 hundredths and here we have 4 tenths. All I need to do to turn this 4 tenths into hundredths is add that 0. When I do that, I'm now comparing 23 hundredths and 40 hundredths, and here I can very clearly see that my 40 is the greater decimal. But without this 0, it's a little bit trickier to see that that 4 tenths is greater than 23 hundredths. So make sure you add that 0 to make both of these decimals hundredths so that we're comparing the same values. When we have a whole number and a decimal, remember that we're always going to compare our greatest place value first. So we're always going to start comparing, in this case, in the ones place, or whichever place value is all the way to the left. When we do this, we can see that 3 is greater than 0, so 3 and 2 tenths is greater than 53 hundredths. That's all about comparing decimals. Go ahead and give a few a try. Here we have 32 hundredths and 2 tenths. Now again, remember, it's really hard when we're comparing hundredths and tenths. So put that little extra step in to turn your decimal into hundredths, and then you can compare, because then we're sure that 32 is greater than 20. Next one I want you to do is 45 hundredths and 5 tenths. For this one, again, all I'm going to do is add a 0 here to my tenths. Now I'm comparing hundredths, and 50 hundredths is greater than 45 hundredths. Next one is 3 and 1 tenths, or 97 hundredths. Well, the 3 is in the ones place, and here I have a 0, so 3 is greater than 0. Next one is 67 hundredths and 9 tenths. All I need to do is add a 0 here and turn it into hundredths. Now I have 90 hundredths and 67 hundredths, and 90 is greater. Next one I have 2 tenths and 16 hundredths. I'm comparing tenths and hundredths again, so I'm going to add my 0 here, and now I can clearly see that I have 20 hundredths and 16 hundredths, and 20 is greater. And then the last one, 57 hundredths and 84 hundredths. They're both already in hundredths, so 84 hundredths is the greater decimal. All right? Comparing decimals, pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Just make sure that if you have a decimal that's in hundredths, then you turn both of them into hundredths to compare. The last thing we're going to look at is this word problem. So which of the following is greater than 12 and 56 hundredths? When we look at all of our options, again, we start with the greatest place value. So we start in our tens place, and all of our tens place have 1. So we're going to move to the ones place next. I have a 2, a 2, a 2, a 3, and a 0. And I'm looking for the greater decimal, so my 3 in the ones place is my winner. So 13 and 87 cents is my greater decimal. All right, that's our lesson for today. We talked about comparing decimals and making sure that both of our decimals were dealing with the same place value. We talked about adding fractions and making sure that when we add fractions, the denominators are the same. So turning those tenths into hundredths, and then adding money. Make sure you're lining up those decimals when you're adding your money. See you tomorrow.